A cowboy who hasn't spoken to another human being in 11 days hears a child screaming on an empty Texas road. He rides toward the sound and finds a 7-year-old girl cornered against a pile of rocks by a coyote, barefoot, starving, with a twisted foot she was born with and bruises shaped like adult fingers on both arms. He shoots the coyote. He picks her up. She weighs almost nothing, but here's what stops him cold. Clutched in her tiny fist is a crumpled piece of paper. 5 children's names written in neat handwriting. 2 of the names have an X beside them. Someone has been counting these children the way you count cattle, and the ones marked with an X, they're not counted anymore. When he carries her into town, the most powerful man in the county, a respected judge, shows up at the door with a smile and a peach pie asking to take the girl. The moment the girl sees his face, she goes rigid with terror. She knows him. And in his ledger, hidden 30 miles south in a compound with barred windows, is the name of the cowboy's own son, the son he thought was gone forever. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk Channel, where the Wild West reveals its deepest stories of courage, sacrifice, and love, born from the dust of broken roads. If your heart beats for frontier tales that stay with you long after the last word, you're right where you belong. This story teaches us that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself, and that the bravest thing a broken person can do is stop running and choose to stay. It reminds us that love is not a rescue. It's a choice made every single day by imperfect people who refuse to give up. If this story already has you holding your breath, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, what would you have done on that empty road? Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start over. And if you're not subscribed yet, tap that button and ring the bell. Because every story on this channel is one you won't want to miss. Now let's begin. Cole Brennan had not spoken to another human being in 11 days, and he was starting to prefer it that way. Words cost energy he did not have. Conversation demanded a kind of performance he had given up pretending he could deliver. Silence was clean. Silence did not judge. Silence never looked at him the way Miriam had that last morning, with eyes that said she had already buried him in her heart and was just waiting for his body to catch up. Then the sound cut through the heat like a blade. A child screaming, not crying, not the whimper of a lost kid calling for its mother. This was the raw, throat-tearing shriek of something small and helpless cornered by something that intended to kill it. The sound hit Cole somewhere deep, in a place he had spent 3 years filling with whiskey and silence. And before his mind caught up to his body, he was already kicking Maverick into a gallop. The Texas sun sat directly overhead, a white coin in a white sky, hammering down with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the ground crack. Cole had been riding since dawn, heading north from a cattle drive that had paid him $14 for 3 weeks of dust and misery. $14. Enough for 2 weeks of careful living or 3 days of drinking. He had not yet decided which path to take, though his hands had been shaking since yesterday morning, and the flask in his saddlebag called to him like a preacher calls to sinners. The landscape was flat and merciless. Cracked earth stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by scrub brush and the occasional mesquite tree too stubborn to die. A dead cow lay 50 yards off the road, bloated and black with flies, its ribs poking through hide that had gone tight as a drumhead. Even the buzzards looked tired, sitting hunched on a fence post with their wings half spread, waiting for the heat to break before they bothered to eat. This was Central Texas in September of 1882. The land did not care whether you lived or died. It simply waited. Cole rounded a rise of limestone and saw them. A coyote, mangy and desperate, had cornered something against a pile of rocks. The something was a girl. Small. Maybe 7 years old. She was pressed against the stones with nowhere left to go, her mouth open in that terrible scream, her hands raised in front of her face as if thin fingers could stop teeth. Between the girl and the coyote stood a dog, a mutt, bone thin, barely half the coyote's size. The dog was barking with everything it had, snapping and lunging, trying to hold the line. It was losing. The coyote feinted left, and the dog followed, and for 1 second the girl was exposed. Cole drew his Colt and fired. The shot cracked across the empty land like a whip. The coyote dropped mid-stride, dead before it hit the dirt. The echo rolled out across the flats and faded into nothing. And the girl stopped screaming, not gradually, not winding down from panic to relief. She stopped like someone had cut the sound out of her with a knife. Her mouth closed. Her eyes went wide and blank. Her body locked rigid. Hands still raised, fingers still spread. She was there and not there, present in body, but gone somewhere inside herself that Cole recognized because he had been to that place too. The place you go when the world becomes too much and the only safe thing left is the darkness behind your own eyes. The dog stopped barking and pressed itself against the girl's legs, shaking. Cole holstered his revolver and dismounted slowly. He kept his movements deliberate and small, the way you would approach a wild horse that might bolt. His boots crunched on dry ground as he walked toward her. Up close, the details came into focus with awful clarity. The girl's dress had been decent once, a blue cotton print that someone had sewn with care, but it was torn now and filthy, hanging off one shoulder. Her hair was dark and matted with dust and something that might have been dried blood near the left temple. Her feet were bare. Her left foot was twisted inward at the ankle, the toes curled under, the whole foot turned at an angle that made Cole's stomach clench. Not an injury. Something she had been born with, a club foot that had never been set or treated. On her forearms, bruises, not the random marks of a child who fell while playing. These were oval-shaped, evenly spaced. The shape of adult fingers gripping hard enough to leave prints that lasted. Cole crouched down 6 feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough not to threaten. The dog growled at him, low and sustained. The girl placed one hand on the dog's head without looking. The growling stopped. "You hurt?" Cole asked. His voice came out rough, scraped raw from days of disuse and dust. The girl's eyes tracked to his face. She looked at him the way a rabbit looks at a hawk, calculating distance and odds. But she did not answer, did not open her mouth, did not make any sound at all. She was not deaf. He could see her flinch when Maverick shifted his weight behind Cole and the saddle leather creaked. She heard fine. She was choosing silence the way you choose a weapon, because it was the only one she had left. Cole looked around. The road stretched empty in both directions. No wagon, no campfire smoke, no sign of any adult within miles. But there were tracks. He stood and walked a slow circle around the rock pile. The girl's eyes followed him. The dog's eyes followed him. He found what he was looking for 20 yards east of the road. Wagon tracks. Not the deep parallel ruts of a heavy freight wagon, but the lighter marks of a buckboard. 2 horses pulling based on the hoof prints. And here was the thing that made Cole's jaw tighten until his teeth ached. The tracks came from the north. They stopped here, right here, beside this pile of rocks. And then they turned around and went back north. The horses had stood for maybe 5 minutes, long enough for someone to climb down, unload something, and climb back up. Then they had driven away. This was not a child who had wandered off from a wagon train. This was not a family too poor to feed another mouth, leaving her with tears and prayers and the thin hope that God might provide. Someone had loaded this girl onto a wagon, driven her out to this empty stretch of nothing, set her down beside these rocks, and left. Deliberately. The way you would dispose of something you no longer wanted. Cole walked back to the girl. She had not moved. He crouched down again. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. "I know that does not mean much coming from a stranger. But I am going to pick you up and put you on that horse because if you stay here tonight, you will die. And I am not willing to let that happen." The girl stared at him. Something moved behind her eyes, some calculation deeper than a 7-year-old should be capable of. Then she did something that Cole would remember for the rest of his life. She unclenched her left fist. Just slightly, not all the way. just enough that he could see she was holding something. A crumpled piece of paper pressed between her fingers, held so tight and so long that it had molded to the shape of her hand. She was not offering it to him. She was showing him she had it. A secret. A treasure. The only thing she owned in the world. Her right hand remained clenched, gripping the dog's fur. Cole nodded slowly. "You can keep that. Whatever it is yours. Nobody is going to take it from you." He moved to her side and slid his arms beneath her. She weighed nothing. Less than nothing. He could feel her ribs through the torn dress, could feel the sharp angles of shoulders that should have been soft with childhood. The dog whined but did not bite. The girl did not struggle. She went rigid in his arms, every muscle locked, her jaw clenched so tight he could see the tendons in her neck standing out like wire. He carried her to Maverick and settled her into the saddle. Her twisted foot hung at its wrong angle, and she winced when it bumped the horse's flank but made no sound. Cole mounted up behind her, his arms forming a cage around her as he took the reins. She sat stiff as a fence post, refusing to lean back against him, refusing to relax even a fraction. The dog sat on the ground, looking up at them with desperate eyes. "Come on," Cole said to the dog. "You too." The dog fell in beside Maverick, and they started north, toward Bitter Creek, toward whatever came next. Cole lifted the girl onto the horse. She weighed nothing. The dog followed without being asked. And somewhere between that burned-out stretch of road and the first mile north, Cole Brennan made the worst decision of his life, or the best. He would not know which for a long time yet. Clara Abbott was elbow-deep in Martha Greer's difficult labor when the stranger rode into Bitter Creek with a silent child and a half-dead dog. And she knew, the way she always knew, things she did not want to know, that her carefully constructed life was about to come apart. She did not see him arrive. She was in the back bedroom of the Greer farmhouse 2 miles west of town, coaching Martha through a breech birth that had been going wrong since midnight. The baby was turned sideways, and Clara had her hands inside this woman's body, trying to find a foot to pull, talking steady and calm while Martha screamed, and Martha's husband paced the hall, and the world narrowed down to blood and effort and the stubborn mathematics of birth. The baby came at noon, a girl purple-faced and furious, screaming her objection to the world. Clara cleared the mouth, tied the cord, wrapped the child in clean cloth, and placed her on Martha's chest. The screaming stopped. The room went quiet, except for Martha's ragged breathing and the soft, wet sounds of a newborn finding her mother's skin. Clara washed her hands in the basin, scrubbing blood from under her fingernails with a brush she kept sharp for the purpose. Her back ached. Her eyes burned. She had been awake for 20 hours, but she smiled at Martha because that was what you did. You smiled and said the right things and pretended that bringing a life into this world made up for all the ways the world would try to break it later. She rode back to Bitter Creek in the early afternoon, the sun beating down like a punishment. Her horse picked its way along the dirt road that served as the town's main street, past the saloon and the general store, and the small clapboard church with its crooked steeple. Bitter Creek was not much to look at. Maybe 150 souls when everyone was home, most of them ranchers and farmers scratching a living from land that fought back. One street, one saloon, one general store, one church, one jail. The necessities of civilization, and nothing more. Clara stopped at the bank first. This was her ritual every time she came to town. She went inside and stood at the counter and asked Mr. Pritchard about the status of her application. "The judge will review it when he gets around to it, Mrs. Abbott," Pritchard said, the same thing he said every time. "These things take time." These things. The ranch. Henry's ranch, which was supposed to be her ranch, which Henry had gambled away in a series of card games so reckless and so desperate that Clara sometimes wondered if he had been trying to lose. The bank held the deed now, and the bank needed Judge Keene's approval on all land transfers over 50 acres. And Judge Keene was a busy man with many responsibilities, and Clara's application was just one of many items requiring his attention. Clara smiled at Pritchard the way she smiled at everyone. Polite, controlled. giving nothing away. "Of course," she said. "I understand." She did not understand. She would never understand. That ranch was the last proof that her life with Henry had been real, that it had meant something beyond a lie and a bullet, and a secret she carried like a stone in her chest. Henry Abbott had not died in a riding accident. Henry Abbott had put his own pistol in his mouth on a Tuesday morning in November while Clara was delivering a baby 3 miles away. She had come home to find him in the barn, still in the chair, the gun on the floor beside him, and she had stood there for a long time, long enough for the blood to dry, long enough for the flies to find him, and she had made a decision. She cleaned the barn. She dragged the chair outside and burned it. She put the gun in the creek. And she told everyone that Henry's horse had thrown him, and he had struck his head on a rock. A respectable widow earned sympathy. The wife of a man who killed himself earned something else entirely. Whispers, closed doors, the assumption that she must have driven him to it, that a good wife would have seen the signs, that there was something wrong with a woman whose husband chose death over staying. So Clara lied, and the lie worked. And she had been living inside it for 2 years, maintaining it the way you maintain a fence, checking for weak spots, patching holes, making sure nothing got through. She was tying her horse outside Rosa Delgado's saloon when she heard the talk. 2 women on the boardwalk, voices pitched low but not low enough. "Rode in an hour ago. Big man, rough-looking. Has a child with him, a girl, but the girl does not speak, and a dog that looks like it has not eaten in a month." "Whose child?" "Nobody knows. He says he found her on the road. Found her, just like that. Just like that." Clara went inside. Rosa's place was cool and dim, smelling of tobacco and cedar and the faint sweetness of mescal. Rosa herself stood behind the bar, wiping glasses with a cloth that had seen better days. She was a small woman, sharp-featured, with dark eyes that missed nothing, and a tongue that could cut glass when she wanted it to. "You heard," Rosa said. It was not a question. "Tell me." Rosa set down the glass. "Drifter. Name is Brennan. Former ranger, if you believe him, though the look of him suggests he has been former everything for a while now. Hands shake like a man 3 days off the bottle. Eyes like somebody put the fire out and forgot to relight it." She paused. "But the way he holds that child, Clara, the way he keeps himself between her and the door, that is not a man who stole a girl. That is a man who does not know what he found, but knows he cannot put it down. Where is he? Corner table. Has not ordered whiskey, which tells me something. Has not ordered food either, which tells me something else." Clara found him exactly where Rosa described. A big man, yes. Broad through the shoulders, sunburned, wearing clothes that had been mended too many times and not recently enough. His hat sat on the table beside an untouched glass of water. His eyes came up when Clara approached, and she saw what Rosa meant about the fire being out. There was something in those eyes that she recognized, the hollow look of a person who was still walking around but had stopped living a while back. The girl sat in his lap, not cuddled, rigid, held in place by his arms but not relaxing into them. Her eyes were the oldest eyes Clara had ever seen on a child. The dog lay under the table, its head on its paws, watching. "I am Clara Abbott," she said. "I am the closest thing this town has to a doctor. I would like to examine the girl." "Cole Brennan," the man said. His voice was sandpaper over stone. "She does not talk. I gathered. And she bites." Clara looked at the girl. The girl looked back at her with an expression that was neither fear nor defiance, but something in between. Assessment. "May I?" Clara said, not to Cole, but to the girl. The girl's eyes went to Cole, then back to Clara, then to the dog under the table. She reached down and patted the dog's head. The dog climbed up into the space between Cole and the girl, settling in her lap. Only then did the girl extend one thin arm toward Clara. Clara took the arm gently and began her examination. Dehydration, severe. Malnourishment, obvious. The clubfoot was congenital and untreated, the bones long since set wrong, the muscles wasted from compensating for an ankle that would never straighten. Bruises on both forearms, fingers-shaped, some yellow with age and some fresh enough to still be purple. A scar behind the left ear, round, the kind left by a blunt object striking hard. Broken fingernails on both hands, torn down past the quick, the kind of damage that came from clawing at something, or someone. Then Clara saw the paper. It fell from the girl's dress during the examination, a crumpled wad that had been pressed against her skin so long it was damp with sweat. The girl lunged for it with a violence that startled everyone. She scrambled off Cole's lap and threw herself at the paper, snatching it from the floor and clutching it to her chest, her eyes wild, her mouth open in a silent scream. Cole was on his feet instantly, hands out, palms down. "Easy, easy now. Nobody is taking anything from you. It is yours." The girl backed against the wall, the paper pressed to her heart, the dog pressed against her legs. Slowly, very slowly, the wildness left her eyes. She sat down on the floor with her back to the wall and held the paper and breathed. Clara had seen the paper for only a moment, but a moment was enough. 5 names, written in neat adult handwriting, ages beside each name, and beside 2 of the names, an X mark. Clara looked at Cole. Cole looked at Clara. "Inventory," he mouthed, so quiet only she could hear. Someone had counted these children the way you would count cattle. The names with X marks beside them were the ones who were not counted anymore. Clara sat down across from Cole at the table. The girl remained on the floor with her dog and her paper and her silence. Outside, the Texas heat pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. "This is not a child who was lost," Clara said quietly. "No. And those bruises did not come from falling. No." "Where did you find her?" Cole told her. "The road, the coyote, the wagon tracks that stopped and turned around. The deliberateness of it." Clara listened with her hands folded on the table, her face betraying nothing, her mind racing. "She can stay at my house tonight," Clara said. "I have a spare room and medical supplies. You can sleep in the shed behind the house if you need a place. I will not leave her. I'm not asking you to leave her. I am asking you to sleep 20 feet away instead of in the same room, because whatever that child has been through, she needs a woman's presence tonight." Cole's jaw worked. He did not like it. But he looked at the girl on the floor, at the way she had curled into herself, at the way her eyes tracked every movement in the room with the precision of a hunted animal. And he nodded. "The dog stays with her," he said. "The dog stays with her." They left the saloon together. Rosa watched them go. And as Clara passed the bar, Rosa said something that lodged in Clara's mind like a splinter. Another family signed their boy over to Judge Keene's guardianship program last week, 10 years old. Keene says the boy will be sent east to learn a trade. Rosa's voice was casual when she said it. Her eyes were not. "Funny thing, though. Nobody ever gets a letter from those children once they go east. Not a single one." That night, Clara watched through her window as Cole sat in the shed doorway, cleaning his revolver by moonlight. He did not drink from the flask she had seen in his saddlebag. Not once. She was not sure if that made her trust him more or less. A man fighting his demons was unpredictable in ways a man who had surrendered to them never was. The girl stole Clara's bread knife during the night. Clara found it under the pillow, wrapped in a strip of petticoat, handle facing out, ready to be grabbed. She was 7 years old, and she slept like a soldier. Clara stood in the doorway of the spare room in the gray light of early morning, looking at the knife and feeling something crack open in her chest. The girl lay on the floor, not the bed. She had pulled the blanket off the mattress and made a nest in the corner closest to the door. Her back against 2 walls, the dog curled around her like a living shield. The paper was clutched in her hand even in sleep. She had chosen the floor over the bed, the corner over the center, the door side over the window side, every choice calculated for escape, every instinct tuned to survival. This was not a child who had been lost for a day or two. This was a child who had been living in fear for so long that fear had become her architecture. Clara took the bread knife back to the kitchen without waking her. She put coffee on to boil and stood at the window and watched the sky go from gray to pale gold. She thought about the names on that piece of paper. 5 children, 2 with marks beside them. Someone's inventory. Someone's ledger of human livestock. She thought about Judge Solomon Keene and his guardianship program, and the children who went east and never wrote home. She poured herself coffee and drank it black and tried very hard not to think about the laudanum bottle in the cabinet above the stove. Cole appeared at the back door an hour after sunrise. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, hands trembling worse than yesterday, sweat on his forehead despite the morning cool, withdrawal. Clara had seen it before in men who came to her after benders, shaking and sick and swearing they would never touch the stuff again. Most of them lasted a week before crawling back to the bottle. Some lasted less. "How is she?" Cole asked. "Sleeping. On the floor. With my bread knife." Something flickered across Cole's face. Pain, maybe. Recognition. "I will talk to her about the knife." "You will not. She took it because she needed it. When she feels safe enough, she will give it back on her own." Cole opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He was not a stupid man, Clara was learning. Stubborn, damaged, and probably dangerous, but not stupid. He could tell the difference between a woman making a suggestion and a woman stating a fact. "Coffee?" Clara offered. "Please." They sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee in silence. The girl appeared 20 minutes later, dragging herself to the doorway on her hands, her twisted foot trailing behind her, the dog trotting alongside. She stopped at the threshold and looked at them with those ancient eyes, scanning for threats the way a general scans a battlefield. "Morning," Cole said. The girl said nothing. She looked at Clara's table, at the 2 cups of coffee, at the space where a third chair sat empty. Then she crawled to the corner of the kitchen, pulled herself up onto the floor beside the stove, and sat with her back against the wall, the dog in her lap, watching them. Clara set a plate of cornbread and a cup of water on the floor beside her. Not on the table. Not in a chair. On the floor at the girl's level, within arm's reach, and then she stepped back. She had learned this from years of midwifery. You did not force. You offered. You created space. You let the frightened thing come to you. The girl looked at the plate for a long time. Then she picked up the cornbread and broke it in half. She gave the first half to the dog. She ate the second half in small, methodical bites, chewing each one thoroughly, making it last. She did not reach for the water until the bread was gone, and then she drank in careful sips, controlling herself, rationing. This child had been starved, not missed a meal or two. Starved, systematically and repeatedly, enough to learn that food was a thing you saved, a thing you hid, a thing that might not come again. Clara watched her eat and felt something in her chest tighten until breathing hurt. The day unfolded in small disasters. Cole tried to pick the girl up to move her from the kitchen to the porch. She was not ready. She clamped her teeth on his hand hard enough to draw blood, and he yelped and dropped her, and she scrambled backward across the floor with a speed that was shocking given her twisted leg, putting her back against the wall, the dog between her and the world. Cole stood there with blood dripping from his hand, looking at her, and Clara saw his face go through about 6 different kinds of pain before it settled on something that looked like shame. "I should have asked," he said. "I am sorry." The girl stared at him from behind the dog. She was breathing hard, her fists clenched, her whole body vibrating. But she did not scream, did not cry, did not make a single sound. Her silence was louder than any noise she could have made. Later, a door slammed shut in the wind. The crash was sudden and sharp, and the girl went to pieces. She dropped to the floor, curled into a ball with her hands over her head, and shook. Not crying, just shaking, her mouth open. Her eyes squeezed shut, every muscle locked. She stayed like that for 20 minutes, while Cole sat on the floor 4 feet away, not touching her, not speaking, just being there. The dog lay across her legs, a warm weight to hold her to the earth. When the shaking stopped, she did not look at Cole. She crawled to the corner, curled up facing the wall, and went still. Cole looked at Clara. His eyes were wet. He blinked and turned away. And Clara pretended not to notice because some things were too private for witnessing. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly. "Nobody does. You learn as you go. I was a terrible father when I had the chance. My boy, Daniel. I was never home. Working. Always working. Chasing outlaws across the territory while my son grew up without me. Miriam, my wife, she told me 100 times, told me I was choosing the badge over my family. She was right, and eventually she stopped waiting." Clara handed him a clean cloth for his bitten hand. "What happened?" "She left. Took Daniel back east. He was 7. He is 10 now, if he is still—" Cole stopped, swallowed, started again. "I have not seen him in 3 years. I do not know where they are." Miriam made it clear she did not want to be found. "Is that when you started drinking?" "I was drinking before. That is why she left. But after I stopped pretending, there was a reason to stop." Clara wrapped his hand with the cloth, tying it neatly. She could feel the tremor in his fingers, the fine, constant shaking of a body learning to function without poison. "My husband drank too," she said. And then, because something about this man's honesty demanded honesty in return, she added, "among other things." She did not say more, not yet. Some doors opened 1 inch at a time. That evening, after Cole had gone back to the shed and the girl was settled on her floor nest with the dog and the bread knife and the crumpled paper, Clara sat in the kitchen in the dark. She sat in the chair across from Henry's chair, the empty one, the one she could not bring herself to move. And she opened the cabinet above the stove and took down the laudanum bottle and measured out a careful dose. Not too much, just enough to make the edges soft, just enough to make the silence bearable. She drank it and waited for the world to blur. And when it did, she put her head down on the table and cried, quietly, controlled. Even her grief was something she managed. The next morning was better, or at least different. The girl was sitting in the kitchen when Clara came in. Not in the corner this time, but near the stove, which had a fire going. The girl had apparently figured out how to add kindling from the box by the door, because the flames were fresh and the room was warm. The dog sat beside her, licking a bowl that had once held last night's bean scraps. "Did you feed the dog?" Clara asked. The girl looked at her. No response. "Thank you for starting the fire." Still nothing. But the girl's eyes flicked to the stove and back, and there was something in her expression that might have been pride. A tiny thing. A crack in the wall. Cole appeared and they ate breakfast together, the 3 of them. Clara and Cole at the table, the girl on the floor by the stove, the dog between them like an ambassador. The girl ate everything Clara put in front of her, and then looked at the plate as if willing more food to appear. Clara refilled it. The girl ate that too. Then, carefully watching Clara the whole time, she took a biscuit and slid it under the edge of the dog. Not feeding the dog. Hiding it. Saving it for later. Clara did not comment. She made a mental note to leave food where the girl could find it, in predictable places and at predictable times, until hiding stopped being necessary. After breakfast, Emmy did something that changed everything. At dinner that evening, Clara served beans and cornbread. The girl was sitting in what had become her spot, the floor by the stove. Clara set the plate down within reach and stepped back, same as always. The girl looked at the plate, looked at Clara, and then, with deliberate calm, she shoved the plate off the edge of the stove shelf. It clattered to the floor, beans and cornbread scattering across the boards. The girl stared at Clara. Her eyes were not scared. They were hard, bright, challenging, daring. This was a test. Clara could read it as clearly as if the girl had spoken the words aloud. "If I am bad, will you send me away? If I break things, will you hit me? If I ruin what you give me, will you stop giving?" Every instinct in Clara's body wanted to snap. She was exhausted. She had not slept more than 3 hours in 2 days. The laudanum headache was throbbing behind her eyes, and she had a kitchen to clean and a life to hold together, and a 7-year-old who had just deliberately destroyed a meal that Clara could barely afford to make. She picked up the plate. She wiped the floor. She went to the stove and made a new plate of beans and cornbread and set it down exactly where the first one had been. She did not say a word. The girl looked at the new plate, looked at Clara. Something shifted behind those ancient eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of the possibility of trust. A door cracked open the width of a fingernail. Emmy did not eat the second plate, but she did not push it away either. That evening, the girl took charcoal from the stove and began to draw on the kitchen floor. Clara and Cole both watched, not speaking, barely breathing. The girl drew with concentration and precision that was startling in a child her age. Lines appeared on the pale boards. A house. Not a simple child's house of squares and triangles, but a detailed structure with a porch and windows and a fence around it. A figure standing by the door. A man, tall, wearing what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. And beside the house, printed in a careful, shaking hand, a single letter. K. Clara looked at Cole. Cole was not looking at the letter. He was looking at the windows of the house. Each one had been drawn with small vertical lines across it, evenly spaced, precise. Bars. The windows had bars on them. Cole carried the image of that drawing into the shed that night. A house with bars on the windows. A man standing outside. The letter K. He uncorked his flask, raised it to his lips, and poured it into the dirt. Whatever was coming, he needed to be sober for it. God help him. The rumor reached Clara before breakfast. Cole Brennan was a drunk, a disgrace, and a man who had killed in cold blood. By lunch, a second rumor followed. Judge Keene had taken a personal interest in the found child. Clara heard the first rumor from Martha Greer's sister, who stopped by to pay for the delivery. The woman stood on Clara's porch and looked past her into the house, trying to catch a glimpse of the strange child everyone was talking about. They say he shot a man in San Antonio while drunk, that the Rangers threw him out for it. People say a lot of things, Clara said. I am just telling you what I heard. A woman living alone should be careful about who she lets close. Clara thanked her for the payment and closed the door and stood for a moment with her forehead against the wood, breathing. Then she went to Gideon Hale's general store to buy flour and salt and whatever else her dwindling money could cover. Gideon was a tall man, thin as a fence rail, with a face that had been weathered by 62 years of Texas sun and 10 years of lost faith. He had been a preacher once, back before the Comanche raids and the border wars, and the slow accumulation of violence that had ground his belief to dust. He still quoted scripture, the way a man might still wear a ring from a marriage that ended years ago. Habit, not conviction. Clara, he said when she came in. His voice was low, careful. We need to talk. About what? Judge Keene was here this morning, asking about the girl. Said it was the court's responsibility to make sure abandoned children were properly cared for. Said he had families back east waiting to adopt. And? Gideon's hands moved restlessly on the counter, straightening cans that did not need straightening. I have known Solomon Keene for 15 years, watched him build his guardianship program from nothing. Saw families sign their children over with tears in their eyes, grateful that someone was offering those kids a chance. But 32 children in 4 years, Clara. 32 that I know of, and I have never once heard from any of them. Not a letter, Not a word through the mail. Children go east, Keene says. Good families, good opportunities. But nobody ever hears from them again. Clara set her basket on the counter. What are you saying? I am saying I have been asking myself questions for 2 years, and I have not liked any of the answers. I am saying that child in your house may be connected to those questions. And I am saying you should be careful. Keene is not a man who likes being questioned. Clara bought her flour and salt and walked home under a sky that had turned the color of old bone. The heat was merciless, pressing down on Bitter Creek like a hand on a throat. Even the mesquite trees looked defeated, their leaves curling inward, conserving what little moisture they had. She was 100 yards from her front door when she saw the horse tied to her fence. Not Cole's horse. A finer animal, well-groomed, with a saddle that cost more than everything Clara owned. She knew that horse. Judge Solomon Keene's horse. Clara's stomach went cold. She walked to the door and opened it and found Keene sitting in her kitchen in Henry's chair drinking coffee from one of her cups. He stood when she entered, always the gentleman, always polished and correct. He was a handsome man in the way that power makes men handsome, tall and silver-haired, with a face that broadcast authority and trustworthiness. He wore a dark suit despite the heat, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. "Clara," he said warmly, "I hope you do not mind. Your door was open, and I took the liberty. I brought a pie." He gestured to the table where a pie sat on a cloth, golden crusted and perfect. "My wife's recipe. Peach." "Judge Keene, what brings you here?" "The child, of course. I understand you have been caring for her, which is very Christian of you. But you must understand that as county judge, I have a legal obligation to ensure that abandoned children in my jurisdiction receive proper care." He smiled. "There are excellent families back east who take in children with special needs like hers. I can arrange a placement within the week." His voice was warm. His words were reasonable. His concern seemed genuine. Clara could feel herself being drawn in the way she always was with Keene. He had a gift for it, this performance of goodness. He had officiated Henry's funeral with words so kind they had nearly broken her. He had signed her land paperwork with a pat on the hand and a promise that he would look after things. He had helped her when she was falling apart. And now he was sitting in her dead husband's chair, offering to take a child off her hands with the same smooth competence. "Where is the girl now?" Keene asked. "In the back room." "May I see her?" Clara hesitated. Something in her gut was pulling, a wordless warning that she could not articulate. But this was Judge Keene, the most respected man in the county, the man who controlled the approval she needed to get Henry's ranch back. She could not refuse him without reason. Of course. She led Keene to the spare room. The girl was sitting on the floor in her corner with the dog, as always. Cole was outside somewhere. She could hear him in the barn. The girl looked up when the door opened and saw Clara, and her expression did not change. Then she saw Keene. The transformation was instant and absolute. The girl's entire body went rigid. Her eyes locked onto Keene's face with an intensity that went beyond fear, beyond recognition. This was the focused, frozen terror of prey that has spotted the specific predator that has hunted it before. Not a stranger. Not an unfamiliar threat. A known one. The dog felt it. Dust had been lying quietly in the girl's lap, but now he surged to his feet and turned to face Keene with his lips pulled back and his hackles raised and a growl coming from deep in his chest that Clara had never heard before. Not the warning growl he gave strangers. This was something else. This was hatred. The girl grabbed the dog and pulled him close, and pressed her face into his fur, and began to shake. Silent, violent, every muscle in her body trembling. Keene looked at the girl, and Clara, watching his face, saw something cross it that had nothing to do with concern or compassion. It was brief, there and gone in a heartbeat, but she saw it. Calculation. The quick, cold assessment of a man recalculating odds. "Poor thing," Keene said smoothly. "She is clearly traumatized. All the more reason to get her into professional care as soon as possible." He left soon after, taking his hat and his manners and his peach pie with him. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him ride away and felt the ground shifting under her feet. Cole came around the corner of the house. "Did you see her eyes?" he said. "She recognized him." "I saw." "That was not the fear of a stranger. She knows that man." Clara wanted to argue. She wanted to find the explanation that kept her world intact, that kept Judge Keene as the kind man who had helped her after Henry died, who held the key to getting her ranch back, who represented order and stability in a place that had precious little of either. But she could not unsee what she had seen. The girl's terror, the dog's rage, and Keene's eyes, cold and calculating, taking inventory of a child, the way you take inventory of merchandise. That night, Clara lay in bed and did not sleep. The girl was in the next room with the dog. Cole was in the shed. The house was quiet except for wind and the distant yipping of coyotes. She was drifting in the shallow waters between waking and dreaming when the dog started growling, low, sustained, the sound of something wrong. Clara sat up. The growl was coming from the back of the house where the kitchen was. She swung her legs out of bed and crept to the window and looked out. A shape was at the back door. A man working the latch with careful, quiet hands, not rattling it, not forcing it, working it the way someone works a lock they intend to open without anyone knowing. Before Clara could move, a second shape came out of the darkness of the shed. Cole. He crossed the yard in 3 silent strides and grabbed the man from behind. They struggled. Clara pressed her face to the glass and watched, her heart hammering as 2 bodies grappled in the moonlight. It was short and brutal and nearly silent. The man had a knife. Clara saw it flash once, saw Cole jerk as the blade caught his forearm, saw him twist the man's wrist until the knife dropped. Then Cole had the man pinned against the wall of the house, his revolver pressed to something Clara could not see. She could not hear the words. But after a moment, Cole stepped back, and the man stumbled away into the darkness, moving fast, not looking back. Cole stood there breathing hard, one hand pressed to his forearm where blood was soaking through his shirt sleeve. Clara opened the back door. "Are you hurt?" "Scratch. Who was that?" "You are the one who caught him." Cole came inside. In the lamplight, Clara could see the cut on his arm, a shallow slash across the meat of his forearm, bleeding steadily but not dangerously. She got her medical kit and sat him down at the table and began cleaning the wound. "He was sent," Cole said. "Told me the judge wants the girl. Said he gets paid to deliver, not to ask questions." Clara's hands were steady. They had to be. Hands that delivered babies and cleaned wounds and held dying men could not afford to shake. But inside, everything was shaking. "Keene is not waiting for legal process," she said. "No. He sent a man to take her. From my house. In the middle of the night." "Yes." Clara wound the bandage around his arm. Her fingers brushed his skin and she felt the tremor in his muscles, the fine, constant shaking of withdrawal, and she thought about how this man had fought in the dark with hands that could barely hold a coffee cup steady, had fought and won, because between his shaking hands and a sleeping child, there was no choice to make. "Who are you, Cole Brennan?" she asked. "Nobody. A drunk. A man who got thrown out of the Rangers for killing somebody." "Tell me the truth." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The man I killed was holding a knife to a child's throat. A girl about the same age as the one sleeping in your spare room. I was drunk. I should not have been there. Should not have been holding a weapon. Should not have been doing anything except sleeping it off somewhere. But I was there, and he had that knife, and I shot him. Board of Inquiry said I used excessive force, said the situation did not warrant deadly action, said my judgment was compromised by alcohol. They were right about the last part, but that girl is alive because I pulled the trigger, and the Rangers dismissed you for it. They dismissed me for being a drunk who killed someone. The rest was details nobody wanted to hear. Clara tied off the bandage. You are shaking. I know. When did you last drink? 4 days ago. It will get worse before it gets better. I know that too. She sat back and looked at him across the lamplight. This man with his scarred hands and his shaking body, and his eyes that had seen the bottom and not found anything worth staying for. Until 4 days ago, when he had found a girl on a road and something had changed. The girl recognized Keen, Clara said. She did. Which means Keen knows what she is, where she came from. Yes. And he sent a man to take her back. Yes. Clara stood and went to the window and looked out at the dark. Rosa told me something yesterday about Keen's guardianship program. 32 children placed in 4 years, not one letter home, not one confirmation from a family back east. 32 children, Cole, where are they? The question hung in the air like smoke. Neither of them had an answer. But both of them knew the answer was something terrible. That evening, Rosa pulled Clara aside at the store. I asked around about Keen's placements. 32 children in 4 years, Clara. 32. Not a single family back east has ever written to confirm they arrived. Rosa's voice dropped. Where are those children? Emmy drew again. This time, not a house, but a map. Crude, shaking lines on the dirt floor of Clara's kitchen. But Cole had read maps drawn in worse conditions, in blood and mud during the Red River campaigns, and he could read this one. She was showing him where she had been. Cole crouched on the floor across from her, studying the marks she made with her charcoal. The girl worked with fierce concentration, her tongue between her teeth, her brow furrowed. The dog lay beside her, chin on paws, watching Cole with liquid brown eyes that seemed to say, "Pay attention. This matters." The map showed a road, a long line running roughly north to south with a branch heading east. Where the branch met a cluster of small marks, the girl drew a rectangle, a building, then more rectangles, smaller ones around the big one, then the fence. She drew it carefully all the way around the cluster of buildings, a continuous line with sharp vertical marks at the corners. Posts, guard posts maybe. Then she drew the K again, larger this time, right in the center. Cole pointed to the main road on her map. Is this the road where I found you? The girl's eyes came up to his. She did not nod. She did not shake her head. But she placed one finger on the end of the road, the northern end, and looked at Cole with an expression that said yes. And this, Cole pointed to the buildings, is where you came from? Before I found you? The finger stayed on the map. The eyes stayed on Cole. She pressed her lips together until they went white. It is all right, Cole said. You do not have to say anything. Just show me. She showed him. She drew small figures inside the building. Stick people, tiny with arms and legs. She drew 6 of them. Then she put bars over the door of the building, the same bars she had drawn on the windows before. Then she drew one more figure outside the fence, alone, moving away from the buildings. Her. Cole sat back on his heels. His mind was doing what it used to do in his ranger days, assembling pieces, reading a scene, building a picture from fragments. The girl had not come from a poor family who had abandoned her. She had come from inside a system, inside Keen's system. She was one of the children who had been sent east, except nobody had been sent east. She had been taken to a place, a ranch, a compound, whatever this map represented. A place with fenced buildings and barred windows and guards at the corners. And she had gotten out. Her clubfoot had been both her prison and her salvation. It made her slow, made her seem helpless, made the guards dismiss her as no threat. But she had walked, all day, all night, one painful step at a time, dragging that twisted foot through dust and scrub and empty miles until she was far enough away that they stopped looking for a limping girl who should not have been able to get anywhere. Except they had not stopped looking. The wagon tracks proved that. Someone had come back to the road where she was supposed to be and had not found her and had driven away. And then Keene had shown up in Clara's kitchen with a pie and a smile. Cole told Clara everything. They sat on the porch that night after the girl was asleep, speaking in low voices, while the stars came out and the wind picked up from the south, carrying the smell of dust and something metallic that said a storm was building somewhere out there. He told her about the map, about the buildings and the bars and the fence and the small figure walking away. He told her what he had found when he went to Gideon's store that afternoon. There was a poster on the notice board, he said. Not a missing child poster. Something called a runaway ward, legal language for a child under court guardianship who has fled. The description matches her. Age, clubfoot, does not speak. Signed by Judge Solomon Keene. $20 reward. $20, Clara said flatly. More than double what was paid for her, I would wager. Clara was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the mesquite trees, making them whisper. In the house, the dog shifted and settled. If Keene is doing what we think he is doing, Clara said, then I have been living under the protection of a monster for 2 years. He signed Henry's funeral certificate. He approved my application for the ranch. He held my hand at the burial and told me God had a plan. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. And every time he was helping me, he was selling children. You did not know. I should have known. 32 children. It was happening right in front of me, and I saw nothing because I did not want to see. Because I needed his goodwill. Because I needed his signature on my ranch application. She turned to look at him. In the starlight, her face was all angles and shadows, beautiful and hard and determined. If I fight Keene, she said, I lose the ranch. He controls land approvals. Every penny I have been saving for 2 years, every payment I have made to the bank, all of it means nothing without his signature. I know. That ranch is the last piece of my life with Henry, the last proof that any of it was real. I know that too. But there are children behind bars because I have been too busy chasing a dead man's memory to see what was happening in my own town. Cole said nothing. This was her choice. He could not make it for her. Clara looked at the stars. Then she looked at the house where the girl slept with her dog and her paper and her bread knife. Tell me what you need me to do, she said. That night, Cole told her the rest. The Rangers, the drinking, Miriam, Daniel. He laid it out like a report, flat and factual. No emotion, no self-pity. He told her because she deserved to know who she was trusting. Because if this went bad, she needed to understand the full picture of the man standing beside her. I am the worst man alive for protecting anyone, he said. But right now, I am the only one here. Clara did not comfort him. She said, My Henry thought he was the worst man alive, too. He was right, but not for the reasons he thought. He was the worst because he quit. She looked at Cole. Are you quitting? No. Then that is all I need to know. But Cole immediately broke that promise. Because that was what Cole Brennan did. He broke things. The next morning, he told Emmy he would be back in 2 hours. He was going to scout the southern road, following the direction her map pointed, looking for the buildings, looking for proof. 2 hours, he said. He held up 2 fingers. He looked her in the eye. 2 hours. He was gone 10. The southern road took longer than he expected. He found tracks, recent ones, wagon and horse, heading into rough country that was hard to navigate. He followed them farther than he should have, driven by the ranger in him, the part that could not stop tracking once it had picked up a scent. By the time he turned back, the sun was well past noon and the shadows were long and he was 2 hours from Bitter Creek at a hard ride. When he got back, Clara was standing on the porch with her arms crossed and murder in her eyes. "She is under the bed," Clara said. Her voice was ice. "She has been under the bed for 6 hours. She will not come out. She will not eat. She will not drink. The dog is under there with her, and he growls if I get too close." I lost track of time. You lost track of time. Clara's voice did not rise. It got quieter, which was worse. "She hides food under her pillow because she believes there will not be a next meal. She stole a knife because she believes she has to defend herself while she sleeps. And you told her 2 hours and disappeared for 10. You just proved every terrible thing she already believes about people." The words hit Cole like fists, because they were true. Every one of them. He went to the spare room. Emmy was under the bed, pushed all the way against the wall. The dog pressed against her, both of them watching the door. Her eyes were dry. She had gone past crying into something worse, a blankness, a retreat to that place inside where nothing could reach her. Cole looked at her and saw with sickening clarity the pattern of his life. The mission came first. Always the mission. Track the outlaw. Follow the trail. Ride 1 more mile, 1 more hour, 1 more day. And the people who needed him, the people who were waiting, they learned to stop waiting. Miriam had learned. Daniel had learned. And now Emmy was learning the same lesson. He did not try to coax her out. He sat on the floor outside the bedroom door and leaned against the wall and talked. Not to Emmy, to the dog. "I messed up," he said. "I said 2 hours and I was gone all day. That was wrong. I'm not going to tell you it will not happen again, because people have told you that before and they lied. But I am sitting right here, and I will be sitting right here in the morning." He stayed. Clara brought him water and he drank it. She brought him a blanket and he wrapped it around his shoulders. The floor was hard and cold and his back ached and his arm throbbed where the knife had cut it, and his hands shook with the bone-deep tremor of withdrawal. He stayed. Hours passed. The house went dark. Clara's lamp went out. The wind blew against the walls. Coyotes called from somewhere in the hills. Cole sat on the floor and waited. When Clara checked at dawn, Cole was asleep sitting up, his head tilted against the wall, the blanket fallen off one shoulder. And the girl had moved. She was no longer under the bed. She was on the floor just inside the doorway, curled on her side with the dog, one hand stretched through the gap beneath the door. Not touching Cole, not quite, but close enough to feel that he was there. In the shed that night, Cole loaded his revolver. 6 rounds. He had 12 more in his saddlebag. 18 bullets between Emmy and whatever was coming. It was not enough. It was never enough. But then again, he had started the week with nothing but a horse and a hangover, and now he had something worse, something to lose. Emmy spoke her first word on a Tuesday, and it was not help or please or even no. It was Dust, the dog's name, whispered into matted fur while she thought no one was listening. Clara heard it through the kitchen wall and pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying. It came out of nothing. The girl was sitting in her corner with the dog, running her fingers through his coat the way she did every morning, a ritual of touch that seemed to anchor her to the physical world. Clara was at the stove, heating water for coffee, her back turned, her presence acknowledged but not threatening. And into the quiet of that ordinary morning, a voice came, small, rusty from disuse, barely louder than breathing. "Dust." Clara froze. She did not turn around. She did not react. She stood at the stove and stirred the water and blinked until her eyes stopped burning, because she understood with the instinct of a woman who had spent her life caring for wounded things that this moment was not hers. It belonged to the girl and the dog, and whatever fragile bridge was being built between silence and sound. The girl said it again. "Dust." And the dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Clara poured the coffee and brought a cup to the table and sat down and drank it as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not just shifted on its axis. As if a 7-year-old girl who had not spoken a word in God knew how long had just whispered a name into a dog's ear and changed everything. Progress was not a straight line. Clara learned this over the next several days with a patience she had not known she possessed. Some mornings the girl would make small sounds. A hum while the dog ate, a sigh when the sun came through the window, almost a laugh when Dust chased his own tail in the yard. Other mornings she retreated to her corner, and her silence and her bread knife, and would not come out until the light changed and some invisible clock inside her decided it was safe again. Cole was learning too. He had taken to sitting on the corral fence in the mornings, working with Maverick, talking to the horse in a low, steady voice that carried across the yard to where the girl sat on the porch with the dog. The girl watched him with those ancient eyes, tracking his movements, studying the way he handled the horse. One morning, Cole set her on the fence rail beside him. She gripped the wood with both hands, her twisted foot dangling, her face tight with the effort of balance. Maverick stood below them, his big head turning to look at the small creature perched above him. "Horse does not care what you look like or how you walk," Cole said, not looking at the girl, looking at the horse. "Only cares if you are honest, you are quiet, you are patient, he will trust you. That is all a horse asks, honesty and patience. People could learn a lot from horses." He was talking to Maverick, and he was talking to Emmy, and maybe he was talking to himself. The girl watched the horse. Maverick flicked his ears and blew air through his nostrils and stood still, patient as the earth. After a long time, the girl reached down one hand. Slowly, carefully, she touched the horse's nose. Maverick did not flinch. The girl's fingers spread against the warm velvet of his muzzle, and she held them there, feeling him breathe. When Cole lifted her down from the fence, she placed her hand on his arm. Not gripping, not clinging, just touching. Her palm against the inside of his forearm, right over the bandage that covered the knife wound. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then she pulled away and crawled to the porch where the dog was waiting. 2 seconds, the weight of a sparrow's wing. But Cole stood by the fence for a long time afterward, looking at his arm where her hand had been, and he did not trust himself to speak. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Sheriff Wade Hobbs rode up to Clara's door. Clara was inside making poultices for a rancher's wife who had burned her hand on a cook stove. Cole was in the barn. The girl was in the spare room with the dog. Wade was a big man, running to fat, with a face that had been soft once and was now going to jowl. He wore his star like a man who had grown so accustomed to its weight that he no longer noticed it. He dismounted and came to the door and took off his hat and held it in front of him with both hands, which Clara knew was his way of pretending to be humble when he wanted something. "Clara," he said, "got a minute?" "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Mind if I come in?" She minded, but she stepped aside and led him into the kitchen and did not offer him coffee or a chair. Wade looked around the room. His eyes lingered on the spare room door. "Look," he said, "I will be straight with you. People are talking. About the drifter sleeping in your shed. About the child. About what exactly is going on in this house. What exactly is going on is that I am providing medical care to a child who was abandoned on a road. And the drifter? Mr. Brennan found her and brought her here. He is staying to make sure she is safe." Wade turned his hat in his hands. "Thing is, Clara, I did some checking on your Mr. Brennan. Former ranger. Discharged for killing a man while intoxicated. Not exactly the kind of company a respectable widow should be keeping." "Is there a point to this visit, Sheriff?" Wade's eyes met hers. Something changed in them. The pretense of friendliness drained away like water down a gulch, and what was left was something harder, colder, a man who owed a debt and was here to pay it. "Clara, you know I respect you, whole town respects you, but people are starting to ask questions about why you have got a strange drifter with a record sleeping in your shed, and you know how it is. There are old questions that nobody wants to revisit." He paused. "About Henry. about how he really died. The air left Clara's lungs. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, and felt the ground opening up beneath her. "What are you saying?" Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. "I am saying that Judge Keene is concerned about the child. He has a legal obligation to ensure her welfare, and he is hoping you will cooperate with the process. Make things easy for everyone." Wade put his hat back on. "Because if things get complicated, Clara, well, complicated brings scrutiny. And scrutiny has a way of turning over stones that people would rather leave where they are." He left without another word. Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to his horse's hooves fade down the road and felt the walls of her carefully constructed life cracking around her. He knew, or Keene knew. One of them had figured out the truth about Henry, or had always known. And they had been holding it in reserve, a weapon to be used when needed. And now they needed it. Cooperate or be destroyed. Hand over the girl or lose everything. The secret, the reputation, the ranch, the entire fragile architecture of her survival. That night, Clara sat in the kitchen in the dark and drank laudanum. More than usual. More than enough. She drank until the edges of the world went soft, and the pain in her chest dulled to a manageable ache, and the sound of Henry's gun stopped echoing in her memory. She was sitting at the table with the empty bottle beside her, and tears on her cheeks when Cole knocked on the back door. She opened it without thinking, without caring how she looked, without managing or controlling or performing. She just opened the door. Cole looked at her face, looked at the bottle on the table, looked back at her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. And Clara, for the first time in 2 years, answered honestly. "No, I am not all right." He came inside. He did not lecture. He did not judge. He sat at the table across from her and folded his hands and waited. And Clara told him about Wade, about the threat, about what Keene was using to keep her in line. She did not tell him about Henry, not the details, not yet, but she told him enough. "They know something about my past that could ruin me," she said, "and they will use it if I do not give them the girl." "What do you want to do?" "I want to pour this bottle out and never touch it again. And I want to tell Keene to go to hell." Cole was quiet. Then he reached into his coat and took out his flask. He held it up so she could see it in the lamplight, half full. Whiskey that had been calling to him for days, promising relief from the shaking and the sweats and the bone-deep ache of withdrawal. He stood up and walked to the back door and opened it. Clara watched him. He poured the whiskey into the dirt. It made a dark, wet patch in the dust, spreading and then sinking in, gone. He came back and set the empty flask on the table. Clara looked at the flask, looked at her bottle. She picked it up and walked to the back door and poured the laudanum into the dirt beside where his whiskey had fallen. 2 dark patches side by side, soaking into the Texas earth. They stood there in the darkness looking at the wet ground, and neither of them called it what it was. He had given up his flask. She had given up her bottle. And standing in the dark with the empty containers at their feet, they both understood. They were choosing to feel everything now. The fear, the anger, the impossible tenderness growing between them, without anything to dull the edges. That same evening, in a house on the good side of Bitter Creek, Judge Solomon Keene sat down to dinner with his family. His daughter had cooked roast beef. His granddaughter, 7 years old, bright-eyed and healthy and full of chatter, ran to hug him when he came through the door. "Grandpa, the barn cat had kittens. 4 of them. Can I keep one? Please?" Keene lifted her up and held her and kissed her forehead. "We will see," he said, which was what he always said when he meant yes. His wife set the table. His daughter poured the coffee. His granddaughter told him about the kittens, about school, about the new dress her mother was sewing for her. Keene listened and smiled and ate his roast beef and was, for this 1 hour, a good man, a grandfather, a pillar of his community. Then, over his granddaughter's shoulder, he looked out the window toward the South Road. And for one moment he wondered, if his granddaughter fell into the hands of someone like him, what would he do? The thought passed. He pushed it away. He had pushed it away hundreds of times. It got easier each time. That was the worst part. Cole had not planned a raid since his ranger days, and back then he had 20 men, federal authority, and the righteous certainty that he was on the side of the law. Now he had a store clerk, a bartender, a midwife, and no legal standing whatsoever. It would have to be enough. They gathered at Rosa Delgado's saloon after closing time, the four of them around a table in the back room, where Rosa counted her money and kept her secrets. Rosa had closed the doors and drawn the curtains and set a bottle of mezcal on the table that nobody touched. "Here is what I know," Rosa said. She spread a hand-drawn map on the table, one she had assembled from conversations with freight drivers and ranch hands and the traveling peddlers who passed through Bitter Creek on their way to somewhere better. Keene owns property 30 miles south in Comanche Canyon. Used to be a cattle operation, but it went bust 5 years ago. He bought it cheap. On paper, it is listed as an agricultural holding. No livestock has been registered to it in 3 years. Then what is there? Gideon asked. Buildings, a bunkhouse, a main house, fencing, and children. Rosa looked around the table. I have been asking questions for 2 weeks, carefully. Through people Keene does not know I know. 2 different freight drivers have confirmed seeing children at the property. Not playing, working, carrying rocks, sorting something. They thought it was strange, but neither one asked questions because neither one wanted to know the answers. Cole studied the map. It matched what Emmy had drawn on Clara's floor. The road, the branch, the cluster of buildings, the fence. When is Keene away? Cole asked. This weekend. He leaves Friday for Austin. Says it is court business, but my cousin in Austin says Keene meets with mining contractors when he visits. People who need cheap labor. Rosa's voice was flat. He will be gone 3 days. The ranch will have 2 guards, maybe 3. I am going in, Cole said. Not alone, Gideon said. The old man's jaw was set in a line that Cole recognized. Stubbornness, the kind that does not bend. Gideon, if this goes wrong, I would rather be wrong beside you than right at home in my bed. I have spent 10 years suspecting and doing nothing. That is enough. Clara spoke up. I borrowed a camera from the photographer who passed through last week. He left it as payment for treating his fever. If you can get photographs of the children, the conditions, the ledgers, that is evidence. Real evidence. Cole nodded. We go Friday night, in and out. Photographs, ledgers, whatever we can carry. We do not engage the guards unless we have to. We do not try to free the children, not yet. If we spook Keene before we have enough evidence, he will move them and we will never find them again. And after? Gideon asked. After we find someone with the authority to act, a federal marshal, a state prosecutor, someone outside Keene's reach. I will handle that, Rosa said. Everyone looked at her. She shrugged. What? I write letters, many letters, to many people. In 3 languages, someone will listen. Friday came with a sky that had gone yellow-gray, the clouds piling up to the south like something building toward a reckoning. Cole saddled Maverick at midnight and rode to Gideon's store where the old man was waiting with his hunting rifle and a canteen and a grim expression. You sure about this? Cole asked. I have quoted scripture about justice for 30 years. Time I did something about it besides talk. They rode south through country that got rougher with every mile. The flat plains gave way to limestone ridges and scrub cedar and dry creek beds that would be rivers when the storm finally broke. Cole led, reading the land the way he used to read it in his ranger days, tracking landmarks against Rosa's map, adjusting for the darkness and the unfamiliar terrain. They reached Comanche Canyon as the moon was going down. The ranch was there, exactly where the map said it would be. Cole pulled Maverick up on a ridge overlooking the valley and studied the layout through the darkness. A main house, dark and quiet. A long bunkhouse, also dark, with small windows that reflected no light because the windows were covered or barred. A smaller building that might have been a storage shed. A corral with no horses in it. And a fence 8 feet tall, running around the bunkhouse and the main house in a continuous perimeter. 2 men sat by a fire near the gate. Guards. They passed a bottle between them and did not look particularly alert. Cole and Gideon tied their horses in a stand of cedar 200 yards from the fence and went on foot. Cole's arm ached where the knife wound was healing, and his hand still shook, though less than a week ago. The shaking would never fully stop, he suspected. Some damage was permanent. But he could grip a revolver, and he could climb a fence, and he could move quietly through the dark, and right now, that was enough. They waited until the guard's fire burned low, and both men were nodding. Then Cole went over the fence while Gideon covered him from outside, watching the guards through his rifle sights. The main house first. Cole slipped through a window that was not locked because who would come out here? Who would bother? He was in an office, a desk, papers, a ledger book thick as a Bible. He opened the ledger and his blood went cold. Names. Columns of names, written in the same neat clerical hand that had written the list Emmy carried in her fist. Children's names. Ages, dates received, amounts paid, and destinations. Not back east. Never back east. Silver mines in New Mexico territory. Cotton operations in Louisiana. A brickworks in East Texas. Each child listed with a price paid to the family, a price received from the buyer, and the difference noted in a column labeled margin. Margin, the profit on a child's life, calculated down to the penny. Cole photographed every page. Clara's borrowed camera was awkward and slow, each exposure requiring him to hold perfectly still for seconds that felt like hours. But he worked through it, page by page, his hands steadier than they had been in months because anger was better than whiskey for stopping the shakes. He found Emma Donnelly, 7, Clubfoot, received March 1882, $8 paid to family, $15 received from buyer, margin $7. She had been sold for the profit of $7. And then he found the name that stopped his heart, Daniel Brennan, 10. Healthy, received June 1882, $25 paid, $40 received from buyer. Destination, Comanche Canyon, pending transfer. Cole stared at the name. His son. His son's name, written in this ledger of human livestock, recorded with the same casual precision as every other child who had been bought and sold through this office. Daniel. Who was supposed to be back east with Miriam? Who was supposed to be safe? Miriam had not gone east. The truth hit Cole like a mule kick. She had not made it. Had run out of money, maybe. Had married again, maybe. And at some point, through some chain of desperation and bad choices, Daniel had ended up in Keene's hands, had been sold into the same system that had swallowed Emmy and 36 other children whose names filled this ledger. Everything connected back. Every thread led to Cole's own choices. If he had not been drinking, he would not have been discharged. If he had not been discharged, Miriam would not have left. If Miriam had not left, Daniel would never have been here. Every page of this ledger was a consequence of Cole Brennan's failures. He almost dropped the camera. His vision blurred. His chest seized. He could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything except stare at his son's name and feel the full weight of 3 years of wreckage crashing down on him. A hand on his shoulder. Gideon, who had come inside when Cole failed to appear at the window. The old man looked at the ledger, at the name Cole was staring at Cole's face. "Is that your boy?" Gideon whispered. Cole could not speak. He nodded. "Then we finish this, right now, and we get him back." A sound outside. Boots on dirt. The third guard, the one Rosa had said might be there. Cole closed the ledger, slid it into the bag they had brought, and they went out the window. The guard was 30 feet away, walking toward the main house with a lantern. Cole stepped out of the shadows and hit him. Not with finesse, not with ranger training. Just hit him. All the rage and grief and terror channeled through his fist into the man's jaw. The guard went down. He was not out. He had a knife. Cole felt it bite his forearm again. The same arm, the same wound reopening, blood running hot over his wrist. He twisted the knife away and pinned the man, and pressed his revolver to the guard's chest. How many children are in that bunkhouse? The guard's eyes were wide. 11. There are 11. Is one of them named Daniel? I do not know names, just numbers. Numbers, not children. Numbers. Cole tied the guard with rope from the corral, and they retreated. Back over the fence, back to the horses, back into the darkness of Comanche Canyon with the ledger and the photographs and the knowledge that 11 children were behind those walls, and Cole's son might be one of them. They rode north. Cole was bleeding. His arm was a mess. The wound opened and angry, blood soaking through the sleeve of his shirt. But he did not feel it. He did not feel anything except the savage, terrible, magnificent weight of hope. His son might be alive. After 3 years of believing Daniel was gone, of mourning him the way you mourn the dead, his son might be alive in a building 30 miles south of here. Gideon rode beside him in silence. He did not try to comfort, did not quote scripture, just rode, steady and solid, an anchor in the storm. Cole did not tell Clara about Daniel. Not yet. One rescue at a time, one broken thing at a time. But the name burned behind his eyes like a brand, and for the first time in 3 years, Cole Brennan did not want a drink. He wanted a war. Judge Keene came to Clara's door at dawn, and he was not alone. Behind him stood Wade and 4 men Clara had never seen, hard men with new rifles and old eyes. Mrs. Abbott, Keene said pleasantly, I have a court order for the child. I do hope we can handle this civilly. The sky behind them was the color of a bruise. Yellow-gray clouds had been building for days, stacking up against each other like boxcars on a siding, and the air was thick with the electric charge that comes before a Texas storm. The wind had been picking up since midnight, hot and restless, carrying dust and the smell of ozone. Every dog in Bitter Creek was hiding. Every horse was nervous. The land itself felt coiled, waiting. Clara stood in her doorway in the dress she had slept in, her hair uncombed, her eyes clear and hard as flint. She had not slept. She had not needed to. Sometime in the hours between midnight and dawn, while she sat at her kitchen table without laudanum and without comfort, she had made her decision. And having made it, she was calm. Cole was not here. He had not returned from the raid. Clara did not know if he was alive or dead or arrested. She did not know if Gideon was with him or if something had gone wrong. She only knew that it was dawn and Keene was at her door, and she was alone, not alone. Behind her in the spare room, Emmy sat on the floor with dust, holding the bread knife in one hand and the paper in the other, listening to every word through the thin walls. Judge Keene, Clara said, before you enter my house, there are some things you should know. Clara, this does not need to be difficult. No, it does not. So let me make it simple. Clara stepped onto the porch. Behind Keene, neighbors were appearing in doorways and on porches, drawn by the sight of the judge and his armed men at the midwife's house at dawn. Good. Clara wanted witnesses. She needed them. I have sent letters, Clara said, raising her voice so that everyone on the street could hear. Not to you. About me. About the fact that my husband, Henry Abbott, did not die in a riding accident. Henry shot himself. I found him in our barn with his own pistol beside him, and I cleaned up the mess, and I lied to everyone in this town for 2 years. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when the world tilts, and everyone has to find their balance again. Wade's mouth opened. Keene's eyes narrowed. I sent that confession, Clara continued, to 3 newspapers and the governor's office in Austin, along with copies of documents that describe what has really been happening to the children in your guardianship program, Judge Keene. The first crack of thunder rolled across the plains, deep and long, like the earth clearing its throat. Keene's face went through several changes in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, recovery. He was good. Even now, even blindsided, he was adjusting, recalibrating, finding his footing. Clara, you are clearly upset. The death of a husband, the stress of caring for a traumatized child, these things take a toll. I think perhaps you need rest. We can discuss this after you have had time to compose yourself. I am composed, and I am not finished. Mrs. Abbott, I have a court order. Wade. The sheriff stepped forward. He did not look comfortable. His hand rested on his gun belt, but his fingers drummed nervously, and his eyes kept moving from Clara to the growing crowd and back. Sheriff, execute the order, Keene said. Wade hesitated. Judge, maybe we should. Execute the order. Wade took a step toward the door, and from inside the house came a sound that stopped him cold. A voice, small, rusty, raw with disuse, but unmistakable. A child's voice speaking for the first time, and the word it spoke was a name. Keene. Emmy appeared in the doorway. She was standing leaning on the doorframe for support, her twisted foot turned at its wrong angle, the bread knife in one hand and the dog pressed against her legs. Her face was white and her eyes were enormous, but her voice, God, her voice was steady. Keene, she said again, and she raised her free hand and pointed directly at the judge. Keene, Keene, Keene. She said it over and over, a chant, an accusation, a naming. She pointed at him with the fierce directness of a child who has nothing left to lose and therefore has nothing left to fear. Dust barked beside her, adding his own voice to hers, and the sound of a 7-year-old girl and a mangy dog filled the street of Bitter Creek like a trumpet blast. The crowd was growing. More neighbors, drawn by the shouting and the barking, and the sense that something unprecedented was happening. They came out of houses and shops and the saloon, lining the street, watching. Keene lost his composure. For the first time in Clara's memory, the mask slipped. Shut that child up, he snapped, and the words came out with a venom that had nothing to do with concern for a traumatized girl. They came out the way a man speaks about a thing that threatens him, a thing he wants silenced. The crowd heard it. Clara saw the shift in their faces, the realization moving through them like a wave. This was not a judge caring for a child. This was a man afraid of what a child might say. Thunder cracked again, closer now. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering in the dust, dark as bruises on the pale ground. Then Cole appeared at the end of the street. He was not riding in like cavalry. He was limping, leading Maverick, his left arm wrapped in a bloody bandage, his face gray with exhaustion. Gideon was with him, equally wrecked, carrying a saddlebag that bulged with the weight of a ledger and a camera. Cole did not draw his gun. He walked straight past the crowd, past the armed men, past Keene, and stopped in front of Wade. He spoke quietly. Only Wade could hear. My son's name is in that ledger, Daniel Brennan, 10 years old. If you help this man today, I will not kill you. I will make sure you live long enough for every person in this territory to know exactly what you did and what you did not do. Wade looked at Cole, looked at the ledger in Gideon's hands, looked at the crowd, at the rain beginning to fall, at the girl in the doorway who was still pointing at the judge and saying his name in that small, terrible voice. Wade stepped aside. He simply stepped aside. He did not draw his weapon, did not argue, did not protest. He stepped off the porch and walked to his horse and stood there with his back to the scene, his head down, his shoulders slumped. A coward to the end. But at least in this one moment, a coward who chose to do nothing rather than something worse. Keene stood alone. His hired men looked at each other and at the crowd and at the sheriff who had abandoned them. The rain was falling harder now, drumming on the boardwalk, running in rivulets down the street. Keene's fine suit was soaking through. His silver hair was plastered to his forehead. His authority, his poise, his careful construction of respectability, all of it was dissolving in the rain like ink washed off paper. "This is not over," Keene said. "No," Cole agreed, "it is not, but today you are leaving." Keene looked at Emmy. The girl looked back at him. She had stopped chanting his name. She stood in the doorway with her knife and her dog and her silence, and she looked at him with eyes that saw exactly what he was and were not afraid anymore. Keene turned and walked to his horse. He mounted up, his movements stiff and controlled. He rode away slowly, down the main street of Bitter Creek, through the rain, past the watching faces of people who would never look at him the same way again. His back was straight, his dignity intact. That was what terrified Clara most. A man who panicked could be predicted. A man who retreated with calculation was already planning his next move. "It is not over," Cole said beside her, rain streaming down his face. "No," Clara agreed. "But today we did not lose." Cole's hand found hers. She let him hold it. And Emmy, standing in the doorway with Dust at her side, watched them with eyes that were for the first time not ancient, just young, just hopeful, just a child's. The rain hammered down. The storm that had been building for days finally broke over Bitter Creek, and it was merciless the way Texas storms always are, the way the truth always is when it finally arrives. It battered the rooftops and flooded the streets and washed the dust from everything, leaving the town clean and raw and changed. Inside Clara's house, Emmy sat on the floor with her dog and let Clara wrap a blanket around her shoulders. She was shaking, but not with fear, with something else, something that felt like the opposite of fear, though she had no name for it yet. She had spoken. She had said his name. She had pointed at the monster, and the monster had flinched. For 7 years, silence had been her only weapon. And today she had found a new one, her voice. The United States Marshal arrived in Bitter Creek on a Thursday, not because Cole had sent for him, he had not, but because Rosa Delgado had written to every lawman, journalist, and politician she could name in 3 languages, and one of those letters had reached a man who still believed the badge meant something. Marshal Thomas Blackburn rode into town on a bay gelding, accompanied by 3 deputies. He was a lean man with a hard face and gray eyes that looked like they had been used to stare down rattlesnakes and had won every time. He wore his star without ceremony, the way a carpenter wears his tool belt. It was not an ornament, it was equipment. He found Rosa first, because Rosa was the one who had written the letters, and Rosa was the one with the answers. Then he found Cole and Clara and Gideon and the evidence they had gathered, and he spent 4 hours going through it with the methodical patience of a man who understood that cases were won with paper, not bullets. "The ledger alone is enough for an arrest warrant," Blackburn said. "Photographs confirm the conditions. The girl's testimony, such as it is, and the guard's statement complete the picture." He looked at Cole. "You broke into that property without legal authority." "I did. If Keene's lawyers are any good, they will argue the evidence was obtained illegally. Then we need more. Get the children out. Let them testify." Blackburn nodded. "That was my thinking. We ride tomorrow." Cole did not ride with them. This was the hardest decision he had ever made. Harder than leaving the Rangers. Harder than pouring out his whiskey. Harder than anything except the day he had come home to find Miriam and Daniel gone. There were children at that ranch who needed saving, and every Ranger instinct in his body screamed at him to saddle up and go, but Emmy was here. And he had learned the hard way he learned everything, that the person in front of you mattered more than the mission on the horizon. "I am staying," he told Blackburn. "The girl needs me here." Blackburn studied him for a moment. "Understood." Cole stood on Clara's porch and watched the marshal and his deputies ride south, and he felt something he had not expected. Relief. He was choosing to stay. choosing the person over the mission, for the first time in his life. Clara stood beside him. "That was hard," she said. "Yes, but right. I hope so." "It was right, Cole." They waited. 2 days of waiting that felt like 2 years. Emmy seemed to understand that something important was happening. She stayed close to Cole, closer than she had ever allowed herself, sitting on the porch when he sat on the porch, moving to the kitchen when he moved to the kitchen, always within sight, always within reach. Dust followed both of them like a furry shadow. On the second day, Emmy said her second word. She was sitting on the corral fence watching Maverick eat, and Cole was standing beside her, not talking, just being present, and she said very quietly, "Horse." Cole turned to look at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Maverick. But there was the ghost of a smile on her face, barely visible, like sunlight through clouds. "That is right," Cole said. "That is a horse." "Horse," Emmy said again, as if testing the word, feeling its weight. Then she reached down and touched Maverick's nose, and the horse blew warm air against her palm, and the ghost of a smile became a real one. Blackburn returned on a Saturday evening. He rode in with his deputies and 2 additional wagons. In the wagons were children, 11 of them, thin, scared, blinking in the sunlight like creatures who had not seen it in a long time. The youngest was 6, the oldest was 12. All of them bore the marks of hard use, bruises and scars, and the particular kind of wariness that comes from being treated as property. The town gathered. Women brought blankets and food. Gideon opened his store and gave away everything he could. Rosa cleared the saloon and turned it into a temporary shelter. Even people who had suspected nothing, who had gone about their business while children disappeared from their county, came forward with help. Shame is a powerful motivator. Blackburn found Cole on the porch. "Keene has been arrested," the marshal said. "He was at his home when we arrived, eating breakfast. He set down his fork, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, stood up, and asked to speak with his attorney, cool as creek water, did not raise his voice, did not resist." Blackburn shook his head. "In 30 years of law work, the ones who go quiet are the ones who scare me most." "Where is he now?" "County jail for now. He will be transferred to the state penitentiary in Huntsville to await trial. The charges are extensive: child trafficking, conspiracy, corruption of office. He will not see the outside of a prison wall again." "And Wade?" "Cooperating. Told us everything in exchange for consideration. He will serve his time at the county lockup, probably 3 years. Blackburn paused. "There is one more thing." Cole's hands tightened on the porch railing. "There were 11 children at the ranch. One of them says his name is Daniel Brennan." The world stopped. The wind stopped. The sounds of the town stopped. Everything stopped except Cole's heart, which was beating so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "Daniel Brennan," Blackburn repeated, watching Cole's face. 10 years old, thin, angry, alive. The marshal paused. "He says he does not have a father." Cole sat down on the porch step because his legs would not hold him. The rain had stopped hours ago. The sky was washed clean, blue and endless, the kind of sky that made promises it might not keep. Somewhere south, in a wagon heading toward Bitter Creek, his son was alive and did not want him. Cole pressed both hands to his face and breathed. That was all he could do. Breathe and wait. The boy who climbed down from the marshal's wagon looked nothing like the son Cole remembered, and everything like the man Cole saw in the mirror. The same hard jaw, the same suspicious eyes, the same way of standing with his weight shifted back, ready to bolt. Daniel Brennan was 10 years old and already an expert at not trusting anyone. Cole stood on the boardwalk outside Rose's saloon and watched his son step down from the wagon. He did not rush forward, did not call out, did not do any of the things that every screaming nerve in his body demanded. He stood still and let the boy see him and decide for himself what happened next. Daniel looked around the town with flat, assessing eyes. His clothes were too big, hanging off shoulders that were sharp under the fabric. His hair was long and matted. There was a scar on his left hand that had not been there 3 years ago. He looked at the buildings, at the people, at the sky. Then his eyes found Cole. Recognition flickered, and was immediately replaced by something harder. "Daniel," Cole said. "I know who you are." The boy's voice was rough, deeper than it should have been at 10. "Ma showed me your picture. Can we talk?" "About what? About where you have been for 3 years? About why you let Ma sell me to those people? About how you chose the bottle over your own son?" Daniel's voice cracked on the last word. The only sign that beneath the armor was a child who had been broken in ways that scars could not show. Cole did not argue, did not defend himself, did not explain that Miriam had lied, that he had searched, that he had not known. Because none of that mattered. Not to a 10-year-old who had spent months in a labor camp believing his father had thrown him away. "You have every right to be angry," Cole said. "I was not there. Whatever the reason, I was not there when you needed me. That is on me." Daniel stared at him. His jaw worked. His hands were fists at his sides. Behind him, Blackburn's deputies were helping the other children down from the wagons, and Clara was there with blankets, and Rosa was directing people with the authority of a general. Daniel turned and walked away. He did not look back. Cole stood on the boardwalk and watched his son disappear into the crowd. And he did not follow. He put his hands in his pockets and breathed and waited. Because that was what you did. You waited. You stayed. You made yourself available, and you let the wounded thing come to you when it was ready. Clara appeared beside him. She did not ask what had happened. She could see it on his face. "He will come around," she said, "maybe." "He is alive, Cole. An hour ago you did not know that. He is alive and he is here, and the rest is time. Time. Time and patience. Things you are learning." That evening, they all ate dinner together. Clara and Cole and Emmy and Daniel and Gideon and Rosa crowded around Clara's kitchen table, which was too small for 6 people, but nobody cared. Gideon had brought bread. Rosa had brought stew. Clara had made cornbread. The food was simple, and there was not quite enough of it, and it was the best meal any of them had ever eaten. Daniel sat at the far end of the table, as far from Cole as the small room allowed. He ate mechanically, not looking at anyone, not speaking. But he was there. He was at the table. He was not hiding in a corner or refusing to come inside. He was there, and that was something. Emmy sat next to Daniel. She did not try to talk to him. She ate her food and fed scraps to dust under the table, and did the thing she did best. She waited. And when Daniel's hand rested on the table between bites, she placed her charcoal beside it, not offering it, just leaving it there. Daniel looked at the charcoal, looked at Emmy. She shrugged. He picked up the charcoal. He turned it over in his fingers. And very quietly, almost unconsciously, he began to draw on the edge of the table. A horse, simple lines, but clear. A horse running, mane streaming back, legs stretched in full gallop. Emmy watched. Then she took another piece of charcoal from her pocket, the one she always carried, and drew beside his horse. A dog. Running alongside the horse, ears flapping, tongue out. Daniel looked at her drawing, looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not a smile, but the crack where a smile might eventually grow. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Emmy in her corner with Dust and Daniel on a pallet Clara had made up in the kitchen, Cole and Clara sat on the porch. The sky was clear for the first time in a week, washed clean by the storm, thick with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Cole told Clara everything, about Daniel in the ledger, about Miriam, about the chain of choices that had led his son into the same nightmare Emmy had escaped from. Clara listened. Then she said, "The ranch. The bank denied my application today. Without Keen's signature, the transfer cannot proceed. The new judge will not touch anything connected to Keen's name for years." "I am sorry. I know what that place meant to you." Clara was quiet. She looked at the house behind them, small and cramped and full of people. "It meant I was still Henry's wife. That some part of that life was still real." She paused. "Maybe I do not need it to be real anymore. Maybe I need something else to be real instead." Cole looked at her. In the starlight, her face was strong and tired and beautiful in the way that real things are beautiful. Not perfect, but true. He kissed her. It was short and clumsy and tasted of coffee and dust. No fireworks, no orchestral swell. Just two people, broken in different ways, deciding that trying was better than not trying. That imperfect love was better than perfect loneliness. From inside the house came a sound, very quiet, a whisper. "I think they like each other." Emmy, talking to dust, the longest sentence she had spoken. Clara and Cole looked at each other, and something happened to Cole's face that he barely recognized. A smile, small, uncertain, rusty from 3 years of disuse, but real. 6 months passed. The seasons turned. The brutal Texas summer gave way to a fall that smelled like cedar smoke and cool earth, and then to a winter that was mild by northern standards but cold enough to warrant fires every night and blankets piled on every bed. Judge Solomon Keene was convicted on 14 counts and sentenced to 25 years at the state penitentiary in Huntsville. He received the sentence standing straight, his face expressionless, his hands folded in front of him. He did not speak. He did not apologize. He was led away in chains, and the courtroom was silent. Sheriff Wade Hobbs received 3 years at the county jail. He cooperated fully, naming associates, identifying buyers, providing the details that helped track down the 38 children in Keen's ledger. 34 were found alive. 4 had died in the mines. The story did not flinch from this cost. Not every rescue comes in time. Not every wrong can be righted. Cole and Clara married on a Saturday morning in the Bitter Creek Chapel. Small ceremony. Gideon officiated. Rosa stood as witness. Emmy sat in the front pew with Dust and Daniel beside her. And she held Daniel's hand because she wanted to, and he let her, because somewhere in the past 6 months, he had stopped flinching at the touch of another person. Gideon said afterward that it was the first time he had read scripture and actually believed what he was reading. Cole formally adopted Emmy. The paperwork was signed by the new county judge, a man named Hartwell, who had been appointed from Austin specifically because he had no connections to anyone in Bitter Creek. Emma Brennan. Legal and proper. Nobody bought or sold. Daniel and Cole were still a work in progress. The boy had not forgiven his father. He might never fully forgive him. But he had stopped flinching when Cole entered a room. He sat on the porch in the evenings instead of hiding in his bedroom. He let Cole teach him to rope, standing in the corral with Maverick, the rope awkward in his hands, his face tight with concentration. He gripped Cole's wrist when Cole adjusted his throw, and he did not look at his father while he did it, but he held on. He held on. He called Cole Sir, not Pa. Maybe not for a long time, maybe never. That was all right, the door was open. Cole built Emmy a saddle. Modified with straps for security and support for her twisted leg, designed from the sketches they had drawn together on Clara's kitchen floor months ago. He fitted it to Maverick on a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming across the hills, and the air smelled like rain and new grass. Emmy's first ride was not perfect. She nearly fell twice. The saddle slipped once and Cole caught her and she yelped, an actual sound of surprise. And then she laughed. A real laugh. Loud and uncontrolled and completely unguarded, the sound of a child who had finally stopped waiting for the next bad thing. Dust ran alongside them barking with joy, and Daniel sat on the fence watching, and Clara stood in the doorway of their house, and the morning was golden and warm and imperfect and alive. Cole rode Maverick home from a day's work on a Tuesday in late spring. The Texas road was still hot, still dusty, still the same road it had always been. The same road where he had found a screaming child and a brave dog and the rest of his life. As he approached the house, Dust ran out to meet him, barking and wagging his tail so hard his whole body curved with it. Then Emmy appeared on the porch, waving, her face bright. Then Daniel, reluctant but present, leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed but there. Then Clara, wiping her hands on her apron, smiling in a way that made Cole forget he had been in the saddle since dawn. Cole had not spoken to anyone in 8 hours, and for the first time in his life, he hated the silence. That evening, Emmy sat on the porch railing with Dust at her feet. Inside, Cole and Clara were making dinner, arguing about whose cornbread was worse, their voices warm and overlapping. Daniel was reading in the corner, pretending not to listen but smiling when he thought no one could see. Emmy looked at the road, the Texas road. She remembered the day Cole had found her, the coyote, the gunshot, the silence she had chosen because speaking had never changed anything. Now she spoke. Not a lot. She still preferred quiet. But she spoke when it mattered. She said good morning to Maverick every day. She said thank you to Clara after meals. She said pa to Cole, and every single time his eyes lit up like it was the first time he had heard it. Emmy did not think of herself as saved. She thought of herself as someone who had chosen to trust again, chosen to let people close, chosen to speak when silence was easier. And Cole had not saved her. He had stopped. That was all. He had stopped instead of riding past. Sometimes stopping is enough. Dust lifted his head, ears pricked toward the road. Emma scratched behind them until he settled. Nothing was coming. Nothing was wrong. The road was just a road. The dust was just dust. And home was right here. Imperfect, loud, full of people still learning how to be a family. She leaned back against the porch railing, closed her eyes, and listened to her father laugh at something Clara said. It was a good sound. It was the best sound. And for the first time in her life, Emma Brennan was not waiting for it to end. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.